the theme for the conference is Unite for Nature, and we're seeing in this room an amazing array of people, all uniting for nature. And right now, outside, there's probably thousands of people uniting for nature and counting birds, because this week is the Great Aussie Bird Count for BirdLife Australia. Wanted to give it a mention because the best bird watching possibly in the country could be in Canberra. So if you see me, okay, you can fight me later, but if you see me outside looking at a tree or at my phone, that's probably what I'm doing. You should do it too. Download the app, count some birds. It's now time to welcome our next facilitator up, in fact, already up, and remind you to use the app to write your questions as we go along. Get them in early. The earlier you're in, the more likely they are to actually be able to get to them up here on the stage. So make sure you start now. Now, we've got the next COP. That's sort of the United Nations Convention of Climate Change big workshop thingy coming up in November. The Biodiversity COP landed last December. The government just put forward the nature repair market specifically to drive private investment. So there's lots of busy activity going on, lots of whole of society is responsible for nature type language. There's so much chat, but that means there's so much opportunity. And to guide us through the topic of Global Biodiversity Framework is Peter Cochrane, one of those people who is completely intimidating on paper, right? He is currently the Vice President of the IUCN. I mean, the IUCN, the amount of times I look stuff up on that website is incredible. He chairs the Sydney Institute for Marine Science, sits on the Australian Heritage Council, and is in the reference group on nature for responsible I've completely buggered it up, Peter. He's with the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, right? So before I embarrass myself any further, please welcome Peter and the panel to the stage.
Thanks, Anne. And could I start by acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging here, but also particularly pay our respects to members of First Nations from Australia and elsewhere here. Your knowledge, wisdom and willingness to share with us is exemplary and a fundamental part of how we can move forward together into the future. Two of our panel members have already been introduced, Jody and Marco, so I won't do that. But quickly, Barry Hunter is the Carbon Manager for NAILSMA, the North Australia Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, and he is also Chair of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation and also currently acting CEO of the Jabbergai Aboriginal Corporation, the country from which he originally comes. And Alex Banks is the Oceania Sustainability Lead for Ernst & Young, and also just more recently been appointed as Global Lead Nature for EY. So we have a fantastic panel up here, and we're going to explore a little bit more of the Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, and I hope no one in this room needs to know too much more detail about it. What we want to talk about is what it means for us, what are the challenges in implementing it, what are the impediments, and what are the opportunities, particularly for private land conservation and First Nations people in Australia. So, without further ado, Marco, I'm going to start with you because you gave us a great introduction this morning, but why is the GBF different? We had the Decade of Biodiversity, the Aichi targets, and only one of 20 targets was sort of partially met. So what's different about the Global Biodiversity Framework?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So actually you hinted what is different, because the only target of the Aichi set that was partially met was the only truly measurable target, the ones with figures in it. That tells you the story. If you have a figure, you have a target, you have a goal, you can measure it, and you at least strive to deliver it. So I think it's safe to say that the GBF is the most comprehensive global biodiversity plan, let's call it, rather than framework, that we had until now. Starting from the mission, which in the past was pretty aspirational and without, diminishing the importance of aspirations, but was a bit fuzzy. And now we have ultra-reverse biodiversity laws, crystal clear. It's in itself a measurable mission. And then goes down to the targets. We have figures 30% on protection, 30% on restoration. We have a clear target on mobilization of resources, 30 billion by 2030 of ODA. And so governments cannot just look at the private sector, they also have to dig deeper in their pockets. And they can, because when they have to, they have done it several times on other topics, so they can do it for nature too. There is an overall goal of 200 billion per year, which will mean an increase of 100 billion per year on current spending on biodiversity overall, and this is where carbon markets potentially could come and help. And there is a target that very few are mentioning, which I think is truly transformational. It's very complex and very ambitious, but also has a direct link to the incentives that could help transition key economic sectors, including agriculture and other on the ground with high special impact sectors like infrastructure, etc., etc. And that target is about eliminating, phasing out, or redirecting, and I'm really keen on the redirecting stuff, $500 billion of perverse subsidies, of harmful subsidies to nature by 2030. I mean, this is huge, huge ambition. And the other thing to say, and I think Barry will comment on that, I'm sure. We all came together with the various indigenous groups around the world and local communities representatives to really push for a clear recognition of the role of local communities in delivering particularly the spatial targets, conservation and restoration. And I think we never had a clearer recognition of that in the framework. So the framework is more ambitious, more measurable, more holistic, but let me also say that I came across an interesting graph recently that was going like this. One line going up like that, and one line going down like that. The line at the top was the number of multilateral environmental agreements. The number at the bottom was the state of biodiversity. So it's still an agreement that needs to be implemented. So let's not rest on the laurels. It's ambitious, it's got all the elements, but it's up to us now to come together and deliver it.
Thanks. And Alex and Jody, you were both at Montreal and saw the Global Biodiversity Framework sort of negotiations and in place. I might start with you, Alex, because also that meeting was distinguished by a large presence of the business and corporate sector as well. So was it what you expected?
Yeah, it was a really interesting session to be part of, and you can't understate the importance of the presence of the finance sector there and how many huge financial actors were there putting pressure on government, particularly around Target 15. The whole campaign around Make It Mandatory and the pressure from financial institutions. What we were kind of hearing on the ground was we don't want to make the same mistakes that we've made with climate, of taking too long for regulatory interventions to be put in place, to wait for too long for appropriate measurable targets to be put in place. Please, we need this to be a mandatory requirement, which is essentially saying to corporates and financial institutions, you have to understand your relationship with nature, measure that, set targets and report on those targets. And, it's disappointing, obviously, that didn't become a mandatory requirement, but a lot of what we've been hearing and what we're already seeing globally is that many jurisdictions will make it mandatory, irrespective of whether it's embedded into the Global Biodiversity Framework. So, a little bit disappointing on that side, but a huge groundswell and a huge amount of interest. I think the thing that we now have to, I guess, be careful of, and I think you could probably add another line to your graph, Marco, which is the number of corporates reporting on nature-related activities or, nature impacts. That is also going up exponentially. The state of the environment is not improving exponentially. So it's something that we need to be really careful of to ensure that appropriate controls are in place to mean that reporting that corporates are doing is meaningful, it's impactful, and it's not greenwashing, essentially.
Thanks, Alex. And Jody, your expectations?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we started engaging with the new framework when the 2011 to 20 Global Biodiversity Strategy was coming to an end. So we'd been engaging locally here with our government through workshops and submissions in the lead up to Montreal. So it was really important to get to Montreal, and it was really important to go to Montreal with a coordinated group of environmental NGOs to be able to be engaging with the government, to be putting pressure and influencing on them to go in with real ambition, with a changed ambition in fact, because only recently had our Australian government changed. So the opportunity to actually lean in and push them to lean in to being more ambitious going into Montreal was really important, and we saw that play out. It was really important for ALCA to be there with a coordinated group of NGOs because we all played to our strengths while there. It was incredible watching the Australian global NGOs working across the convention and really influencing and engaging their various governments in leaning into some of these issues. It was really interesting watching some of the challenges and complexities between different countries, some developed, some developing, and balancing those tensions and watching the way the international NGOs were able to engage and negotiate really strong outcomes. It was fantastic working with the other Australian NGOs that were out there, and some that were leaning into Target 15, some that were leaning into other targets like the 30 by 30 target for protection and the 30 by 30 target for restoration, and we all drew on our strengths. And for private land conservation, to be able to be there in the room and to say why it is so important that private, particularly in the context of the role that private land conservation is ultimately going to have to play for delivering the framework, and I can talk a bit more about that later.
Yep, thanks, Jody. And Barry, in the Global Biodiversity Framework, not for the first time, but certainly very significantly, there is specific mention right through it of the important role of Indigenous peoples and First Nations, both knowledge, respecting their rights, so from your perspective, what comfort do you get from the Global Biodiversity Framework that actually something will change here? What needs to change from your perspective, and does that provide the framework for you?
I think we only got 30 minutes, Pete. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge Ngunnawal people and Aunty Violet for a warm welcome to country this morning. To answer the question, I think that there's a number of things, and fundamentally, just got a great reminder in that last Indigenous Protected Area session with Cyril, one of the Central Desert Rangers, stood up and in regard to the question around biodiversity and markets, and his response, if I can paraphrase, was to say that country is a whole, and spirituality and old people live in country, and it's that basis to be able to respect and understand that connection that we need to come from first, and in fact that sets the way that we interact and deal with it, for Indigenous people, being able to put that up, that segmentation of country and knowledge of country is quite often not considered within the approach to management, and indeed an approach towards any sort of future financial systems that we talk of as well. So that's one aspect, and I think that's sort of the fundamental and baseline aspect, is that long-standing connection to country, but also recognising that credit to where credit should be shown and given, and the Australian government and their amazing work around Indigenous protected areas and ranger programs. And we see, like between 84 and I think the latest figure is 87 million hectares put aside now for Indigenous protected areas. But within that, I think there's, we can't rest on our laurels around that. We need to see that with a grain of salt, and as pointed out around within that session as well, around the level of funding that goes into Indigenous protected areas in comparison to broader conservation estate and disparity in funding there, and there's some figures around that. So it's being able to look at those things in that light and say, okay, well, yeah, we can be assured that IPAs are held up internationally as well. You know, the Canadians want to copy what we're doing, and you see, you know, with their Guardians program, that and that's all admirable and very exciting for, you know, the product that we've developed as a nation. But yeah, there needs to be still a lot of work done around it, and we can't let. We need to hold people to account and hold the government to account that we can't sit back and say, just because Indigenous protected areas now is 50% of the National Reserve System, we've done our job. There's still heaps to be done out there.
Yeah, so when Tanya Plibersek welcomed the 30 by 30 particular outcome for GBF, she signalled that the government would be leaning particularly on private land conservation in Indigenous protected areas. So I don't think it's a matter of just try harder. There's something that's got to change and shift quite significantly. And Alex, I might just turn to you in terms of the private sector role in helping facilitate that, because it's not just a little bit more. We're talking about something quite significantly different now.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting time because there's a convergence of things happening, a convergence of issues. So, you know, we have the Global Biodiversity Framework, and a lot of people, you know, in this room, but particularly in government, are going to be talking about that. And at the same time, there is a really significant shift in the corporate sector around a transition from voluntary reporting on sustainability impacts into the mandatory reporting space. And I have to have another acronym, and you'll forgive me, but the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, for anyone in the room who is working, you know, as a sustainability manager or in a sustainability role, you'll be super aware of that. But for those of you working in the private land conservation space, you may not be, and it's actually going to be a massive, massive catalyst for change in your sector as well. Because essentially what the ISSB is doing at the moment, it's very focused on climate. So it's essentially saying organisations need to understand their climate risks and opportunities, to measure those risks and opportunities and report on them. But what the ISSB is going to do in the future is look at other sustainability related issues and also create reporting standards for those. So it's essentially telling all of the accountants, all of the financial operators in all of the big companies in Australia and the world, you need to start thinking about these other sustainability matters, including nature, measure your impacts and dependencies, reduce adverse impact, create positive impact, and report on that. And what that is going to mean is that all of the huge corporates in Australia are going to be looking for opportunities to reduce harm to nature within their value chains and to create positive impacts on nature that are measurable and reportable. And that is massive. The other acronym is the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And again, that is going to significantly kick up the level of interest in private land conservation and the level of interest in collaborating with organisations like yours. They're going to be looking for partnership opportunities, looking for your advice and support into how can you come into the room to advise them on nature-related projects that will be measurable and reportable and can go into a Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures aligned report. So you really do need to be aware of some of these international developments around voluntary and mandatory reporting, because it's going to create a huge amount of demand for nature-positive activities in the future.
So when I was talking to Marco earlier about this, that huge diversity and competitive suite of metrics and indicators and methodologies, et cetera, but to what extent do you think the TNFD will act as a bit of a funnel that's going to force all of those in through to a more common framework?
Yeah, so it's a good question around TNFD because, and we're often asked this by our clients, like, when are we going to have to do TNFD, or when are we going to have to report in line with TNFD? And what we kind of say to them is, like, the trajectory of climate-related reporting is a good predictor, but the pace is going to be quicker because a lot of the kind of building blocks of what measurement and reporting will look like have been set. And the way that I kind of think of it is that the Paris Agreement informed the TCFD, which has now informed the ISSB climate-related disclosures. And in a similar way, the Global Biodiversity Framework is informing and has informed the TNFD, which is going to inform the biodiversity ecosystem services, or whatever version of that goes into the mandatory reporting suite as well. So it is both a driver of, a funnel of kind of focus. And what that also means is that in the interim, the companies that want to set themselves apart are going to do TNFD, or kind of start with the TNFD process, because it's a good predictor for what might be mandatory reporting in the future. And the big opportunity in relation to TNFD is both to support companies to understand how to reduce harm to nature in their value chain, but also how can they start to create positive impacts on nature. And, conserving land, we are talking about huge mining companies, huge property companies, huge retailers that these incredibly enormous portfolios of land in this country that are going to be looking to your sector for advice on how do we improve the quality of that land, how do we protect that land, how do we measure the biodiversity attributes within that land, and how can we report on them. And there is a huge amount of knowledge in this room that is going to be needed by the corporate sector, and I would just encourage and hope that you're going to be out there helping them, and that they will compensate you appropriately for that help, because that's also important.
Now, Barry, one of the things that has been, and I'm going a little off-piste here, but the nature and culture divide that bedevils a lot of conservation at the moment. You were part of the Reimagining Conservation Forum late last year, where we were talking a lot about how you, the problems of separating out nature from culture and people and country. It seems to me there's a bit of a challenge with some of these frameworks. If the focus is just on nature and not people as well, the potential impediments for getting this right here. I mean, a huge opportunity, because we have done some things pretty well, particularly through Indigenous Ranger programs, IPAs. But how do we make sure that these things travel comfortably together? And I'm going to come to Jody on that one as well, because the private land conservation movement's got a lot to offer in that regard as well. But
I think part of the answer is around Indigenous leadership, and we're already seeing some emerging examples of either Indigenous-led or where there's strong Indigenous involvement in the development of different types of frameworks. And those frameworks, while some of them are in their infancy, I've got a lot of faith that the tracking is right, and it is showing, and the criteria that I sort of talk of around Indigenous leadership and Indigenous-led, and I think there's two different things in that regard, and that's ownership of that as well, and then acceptance of that. And I talk right through the system. So, say for environmental markets or any sort of biodiversity offset or credit system, that there's Indigenous-led integrity processes within that, and those processes talk to assessment and criteria that's set out by traditional owners. And I know there's it's a lot of different. There's no homogenous approach to culture and Indigenous culture in Australia, but nonetheless there can be a framework that can be built where the key principles of Indigenous recognition of country and where people identify keystone species and cultural indicators, that they form the basis of Indigenous approach towards those methodologies. And I think that's the important, and being able to build that. Key example is the cultural fire credit, and there are other similar types discussions that are occurring, frameworks being developed around blue carbon, where Indigenous-led indicators, and some of those examples, the early examples that are coming out, is that showing that some of those keystone species aren't much different to what ecologically would be significant as well. So there's not too much difference and it's just the approach, and the approach is recognising Indigenous knowledge and culture.
And Jody, before we come to you, if you've read the session information blurb for this session, right at the bottom there are 2 questions, and a QR code will come up here, which if you scan in, you can feed your answer into the QR code. This is separate from the Q&A system, so that's the QR code. If you click on that, there are a couple of questions there, and at some stage or other, we will come back to that to see what your responses to those 2 questions have been. So, Jody.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, listen, I think it's a great question, and what Barry said, but also there's an opportunity so if you think about Target 3, for example, Target 3 is the protection target, and Australia actually has quite a unique program of protected areas system. Different and, in some ways more advanced than in many other countries that enable and allow for stronger recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people delivery to achieve 30 by 30. We've got in Australia a strong IPA program that isn't seen in many other countries around the world. We've got a public estate system, and we've got one of the world's largest private protected area networks or systems in the globe. So we actually have a number of existing pathways for achieving a 30 protection target that really wraps around and enables opportunities for the people part of the discussion. Absolutely across all of those, we should be strengthening access, ownership and management for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we should be strengthening those systems that exist. I think the other thing to the point about people is that this is a real opportunity. If we are to deliver the Global Biodiversity Framework in its truest sense, it will require a whole of society response. It will require a whole of government response. So we can't keep looking to our Environment Department to deliver the solutions or find the programs and pathways to deliver this. It needs the whole of government to be involved. If you look at the targets, Target 3 is the 30 by 30 target. Target 2 is a restoration target. So you're going to need a whole lot of different mechanisms being applied across a whole lot of different land tenure, and it's going to be relevant to community all over Australia. It's going to mitigate climate change as well as achieving a scale target. It's going to buffer against drought. There's a whole lot of other benefits that are going to result in benefits for people. There's a halting in human-induced extinctions target and a tackling invasive species target number 6. Both of these targets are all going to need Indigenous protected areas, private land getting engaged and changing their management. Then you go to the number 10 industry target. Again, you're talking about sustainable land use. So if we're genuinely going to deliver this in its fullest sense, there will and has to be a really strong people element to this. And if you just look at that list, there is a predominant privately managed land element to that, and a really strong opportunity for greater access and opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Can I just add something really quickly? And I completely agree with everything that Barry and Jody have said. The TNFD, I think, is kind of doing some work to try to recognise essentially exactly what you're talking about. And in the definition of nature, it basically defines people as part of nature. So a nature strategy has to contemplate people and people's impacts and dependencies on nature. The version of the TNFD, which was just released on the 18th of September, kind of differing from the prior versions that had come out, actually enshrines consideration of Indigenous people's rights and community rights, human rights, into an organisation strategy. So you have to be contemplating Indigenous issues and human rights issues as they pertain to nature if you are preparing a TNFD-aligned disclosure. We've just finished piloting the prior version of the TNFD with a number of corporates and financial institutions in Australia, and one of the things that we found through that process is that there are a number of recommendations about stakeholder engagement, particularly Indigenous engagement if that's relevant to a corporate or financial institution. And this is going to create a significant amount of expectation and need from corporate Australia on Indigenous stakeholders. So the legitimacy of a nature strategy, the legitimacy of a response that is aligned to TNFD is couched on appropriate engagement with Indigenous stakeholders. And the thing about that I think is so important is that can either go down the track of putting an undue amount of pressure on Indigenous people to validate and legitimise corporate responses to nature loss, or it can create an incredible opportunity for partnership and elevating and supporting Indigenous stakeholders to play the role that we need them to play in educating and uplifting and caring for country. And, my final point on that is just like, I love the concept of caring for country, but I don't think we need to be, putting all of the pressure just on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to care for this country. It is all of our responsibility to do that. We have a lot to learn from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about how to do that, but we all have to be caring for the country. It's not just their expectation to do that.
And Jody, you mentioned this area of collaboration at the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiations, and that's the point you're making. And Marco, I might just ask you, this whole question of people working more collaboratively than competitively, given the urgency, if we're at a tipping point, the turning point in that will be we actually do work more effectively together.
Yeah, that's not a great strength of humanity, isn't it? Work together. Unfortunately, everybody would agree that together is great, but actually making it work, it's hard. But yes, and this goes back to the ambition of the GBF. This plan is incredibly ambitious. I mean, think about a plan that gives you the goal in a decade, in fact less, to reverse the trend of centuries, and particularly the incredibly accelerating trend of the last few decades, in less than a decade. So incredibly ambitious, requires obviously integration and collaboration across all sectors, as Jody just said, and requires particularly to mature and to develop the conviction that we need to disrupt the current system. Because honestly, I was born on species conservation, protected areas, but those two targets at the top of the GBF won't cut it. We need to really tackle the system change at economic level. Our economy is today the engine of nature loss, and we need to tackle that particular dimension of the GBF, which is not so well articulated, because of course, as was said earlier, GBF is about Ministry of Environment agreeing on a global framework, and of course, the power, economic and otherwise, is not most of the time in their hands. So we need to bring political leadership, and this is about actually the blockages and the obstacles and the challenges related to the implementation. Political leadership that really brings the whole of government, the whole of country united to tackle these issues, and particularly focusing on the financial flows that could actually accompany the transition. For me, this is absolutely critical. I mean, what's happening now is that we are taking little steps here and there, one government or the other, and what we are seeing is that not decisive leadership, not decisive supporting and enabling plans are actually creating even more anxiety and uncertainty in the stakeholders. Farmers are opposing farm reform all over the world. Not because they don't want the reform, because they don't understand it, they are not reassured, they're not accompanied, they're not engaged and involved. And so, to your point, absolutely, but we need to all work together, but we need also the political leadership that makes that happen. And that's one of the biggest challenges I think they're going to face in the next few years. Having said that, when we started the final week of Montreal, with all the geopolitical tensions, at the time, don't mention countries, I don't need to mention countries, we thought this is it. This is going to end up in a Copenhagen for nature, and no, it didn't. So in a way, let's be hopeful that the recognition of the value of nature, not just ethical, not just moral, not just spiritual, which is super important for all of us, but also material to our well-being, economy, and development, will drive that unity that we need to deliver not just UBF, but to deliver a safer future and a nature-positive future.
Yeah, right. So materiality, so just a fundamental question of why nature is so important and the recognition of it. But Jody, if I can unfortunately use an elephant reference, the elephant in the room here is that the central agencies aren't here. The central agencies aren't here. So the locus of decision-making in government sits with treasuries and the central agencies. And so while we operate in an echo chamber of like-minded, things aren't going to change. So the big hope at the moment, I think, is the corporate sector is now deeply engaged in this and driving change. But reaching those central agencies, that's still a huge challenge, isn't it?
It's an absolutely huge challenge, and I think that goes to the point that I made before around this. This truly does need to be a whole of government approach. We need other agencies at the table that aren't the ones that we're talking to. I think I was talking to somebody earlier today about this is good. We've got more people in the room. There needs to be more people in the room, and that is a really, an ongoing critical challenge. One of the things that we have done, part of the statement that we're making, this isn't a statement, yes, we're going to be taking it to Minister Plibersek this week, but ultimately it's a statement to the whole government about building a stronger ambition and about recognising that this isn't just their Environment Department's responsibility, but this is the whole of the government's responsibility. So the Prime Minister at the very top needs to be taking leadership for implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework here in Australia. And we're not often hearing from him on that. So yes, absolutely there needs to be more central agencies at the table.
Fantastic. We've got 10 minutes left, so can we see the results of the responses so far to those questions with a word cloud, which has a lot of words on it.
Funding.
It's got a lot of very small words on it, other than Unite for Nature. What's coming up in terms of the funding? Seems to be the largest font there. Okay, Jody, we're going to use this as part of the product from this this session. Okay, fantastic. While you're looking at that, I'm going to have a look at the questions that are, I'm sure, flowing in. Well, I'm not actually, because the iPad's just gone black. Oh, here we go. Excellent. There are a number of questions here. Josh Bishop has asked, what are the risks and opportunities of the Global Biodiversity Framework emphasis on other effective area-based conservation measures, i.e. those things not in the currently in the formal reserve network? Jody, do you want to have a go at that, Barry?
I was completely distracted looking up at the word cloud there, Peter. Do you want to ask that one again?
So the inclusion in the Global Biodiversity Framework of other effective area-based conservation measures, which has created some consternation in the conservation community as being easy outs. Yeah. So from your perspective, risks and opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely presents opportunities. We have, as I outlined there, we've got an existing set of solutions that are absolutely there, already being implemented, and with greater resourcing. And I don't mean just financial resourcing. There are policy barriers that might be affecting our ability to deliver an existing program like private land conservation, for example. So ensuring that, while we drive to a 30% target, so we're at 22%, we need another 60 million hectares. Each of the three existing strategies that we have in hand can be readily scaled up to achieve that target. There is an opportunity for OECMs to support that. They need to be really strong, they need to be really credible, and they need to stand for the enduring and long term. So as long as those things can be applied, then there's an opportunity for OECMs to be able to be implemented and contribute to that. And I think OECMs can also play a part, or where they may not reach an OECM standard, they're very relevant for the other targets that sit and exist there. And I think we get very focused on the 30 by 30, when in fact a lot of the things that are brought forward could very well deliver some of the other targets.
Can I add one thing? A little controversial, but I have to say this. And I completely agree, Jody. I think these OECMs is giving space to innovation, different ways to deliver conservation and restoration, absolutely fundamental. But we need to really watch it, because I'm not going to mention the country, but I've seen a draft NSAP that will have to be presented in COP16 probably next year, where as part of the OECMs of the country, sustainably managed golf courses was listed as a category in the OECMs. So I'm saying this is a bit extreme. This is a bit extreme, right? And I'm sure not many countries will go down their route. But there is an issue to watch here, because unless we put clear definition, boundaries, standards for those OECMs, we're going to risk to achieve the 30% a day after COP16, even before 2030. Simply with not even paper parks, but just fake conservation areas. So we got to be really strong on definitions, but at the same time stimulate innovation, because there is definitely the need for different ways from the classic approach to conserve areas.
Yep. Actually, you do mention an important element as well of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the accountability, which is the reporting back. So there is an obligation to report back. It's not quite the status of the global stocktake for the Climate Change Convention, but nonetheless, there is an obligation on countries to report on what they're doing. It's not a matter of waiting till 2030. Next year, they have to start reporting on how they're implementing. So that's encouraging. Marco, given your international perspective, and you've been hearing a lot of what's happening in Australia, how positive do you feel that the innovation and the various approaches that we're trying here will make a difference, and are there opportunities rather to learn from our innovations, mistakes, as well as successes? Because we have a go at things.
Absolutely, Australians are doing better than everybody else. And I'm saying this every time I go everywhere in every other country. No. But obviously, first of all, you have a massive responsibility. Let's acknowledge that first, because you are holding such a vast amount of biodiversity ecosystem services that benefits your country, your economy, your people, but also the world. And so I think the world needs to pay attention to this as well, and applies to you and many other countries rich still in nature. So, but I think the vibrancy and the energy that I feel is in this country is truly heartening, because there are many issues like everywhere else, but there is a clear focus on doing things differently. And I heard it this morning in many of the in the session they attended. I heard it by attending meetings with the government and with civil society in Sydney last week. So I have to say there is a strong focus on doing things differently, and that's probably something that you can offer as a big contribution to the whole GBF implementation moving forward.
Yep, fantastic. And Alex, from your perspective as global lead nature, are we offering things to the world, or are we also tapping into what is being done elsewhere effectively?
Yeah, I think that what you just described, Marco, I often kind of think of as this amazing Venn diagram that we have in this country of mega diversity, of a developed economy, of an economy that is significantly dependent on nature, and then also people with a significant amount of will. And then the kind of fifth part of the Venn diagram is, a significant degradation of nature and things not going in the right direction. And just to agree with you, Marco, it means that we have even more of a responsibility to lead. I think that's potentially part of the reason that EY has centred the leadership role out of Australia, because the role of the Global South in achieving the Global Biodiversity Framework cannot be understated. And when I think back to Montreal and I think back to that, the finance day in that room, it was so dominated by the global north, and particularly by Europe and also by America or North America. And that's not where the biodiversity is, to be honest, that we really need to focus on saving now. And so I think as Australia, as an economy that has the imperative and the ability and the opportunity to really set a standard for what conservation, restoration and regeneration of nature can look like, whether or not we want to, we have to do that, and we have to lead on that. And I'm trying to be optimistic about that. I think that the Nature Summit next year is a really good example as well of how the world kind of sees Australia in this space of like, okay, you guys want to lead this, then go for it, but we're going to be watching you, and on all the measures that count, you're not going in the direction that you need to. The state of your environment is nowhere near where it should be, considering the economic opportunity that you have, and your economy is so dependent on nature. This is the thing when we think about our industries, about contribution to GDP, about our export industries, all of this, they are so dependent on nature. So, the economic survival of this country is dependent on us working out a way to live in harmony with nature and to regenerate and restore nature within the timeframes.
We're into the red, so quickly, last comments on the opportunities and challenges from the GBF. And we haven't really talked about the challenges, we've talked more about the opportunities, but there's clearly a few impediments to making this happen. Jody?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I think in the short term, one of the biggest challenges is getting the NB SAPs up and running. We've got a pretty short time frame to do that, and it's going to take quite a lot of resource to get the targets right for Australia, for every single country. So we're focusing on that at the moment. The opportunities, I think, are many. If done well and correctly, I think there's an opportunity. One of the biggest opportunities is for that deep engagement and connection with the whole of society and community around this. I see that as a really big opportunity. The other opportunity we haven't really talked about is things like investment in data and information. There's a huge, this whole thing is going to require monitoring, particularly if we want to be successful this time around. And that was one of the biggest barriers we talked about with the IHE target. So data, knowledge and information is going to be important, and that presents opportunity for cross-sector initiatives and different kinds of investments coming into the sector.
Barry?
Peter, I just reminded that we've talked strongly about Indigenous protected areas in this forum, and rightfully so. And I just want to say thank you to all those last presented in that last session. But Indigenous interest, whether exclusive or non-exclusive, covers 54% of Australian mainland, and within that, there are a lot of groups and organisations and traditional owners that either sit outside the system and aren't necessarily engaged, but still have country to look after and obligations to look after country. So yeah, there's still a fair bit of work to do around that.
Thank you. And Alex?
To Marco's point before, 2030 is really close now, 6 years, I think 6 years and 2 months or something. And yes, there is a huge amount to do in 6 years, but I find great comfort in the fact that as a species we have much more knowledge of how to live in harmony with nature on this planet than the last couple of 100 years when we haven't, and we really need to tap into that. And so that, we have been here for millennia living in harmony with nature and being part of nature, so I hope we can tap into that.
Thanks, Alex. Marco?
I thought I already... I know I want to finish on a positive note as well, like Alex. I think we've never been in a situation where we understand better what we need to do and our dependency on nature. People are worried. Nature, destruction of nature, wildfire extinction is not something where we are any longer sad about only. We're also really worried. And this is something that is the seed for change. And what will make a difference, what will define success or failure is the speed of that change. And that's where all of us we need to focus on. Push for acceleration of the change, that we know where we need to go there faster. And we can.
So with
and we must. And it's necessary. And otherwise we'll be a mess. So we absolutely need to do it.
Absolutely.
We know that for sure.
So with all the intelligence, ideas, drive, passion and testing that's going on in this room, I think there's every reason for optimism, but none whatsoever for complacency. Thank you all. Join me, please, in thanking our speakers.
Thank you. I think you get one of these. Do you get one of these? Yeah, you get one of these. Oh, wait, thank you. You get a book. Yeah, no. We've got the... Now, as the panellists go off, wait, don't go leave without your book. Oh, a book. Lovely, thank you. I'm a cool, calm and collected MC. We're going to get a photo of everyone. There's a photographer here somewhere who wants a photo of us all, right? Yeah, someone's around. And a little bit of housekeeping before I throw over to Jody again. Tonight's housekeeping. If you are going to the conference dinner, this info is for you. Buses will be departing from the convention centre, sort of out the main front doors and around that way. They'll be departing at 6 p.m, but they will return you to Crown Plaza, which is the hotel just over there, which means you can kick on to the casino, right? I don't recommend it because tomorrow is going to be really busy. So they'll be dropping you off just around this side, okay, just so you don't get confused. There's seating allocation. It's been posted in the app. There's like a little thing that says conference dinner and you'll be able to find out who you're sitting next to. And for those of you who have bought tickets to the policy breakfast tomorrow morning, thank you, because apparently it's sold out. That'll be held upstairs, up there. So when you come in the morning at 7:20, up there for that breakfast. But for right now, let me throw over to Jody. She's back.
You'll be tired of seeing me soon. Can I also bring onto the stage Mr. James Hatton? James is the chair of ALCA's Sector Development Committee, and I thought it would just be a nice way to wrap up the afternoon by having a bit of a chat to James. Welcome to the stage, and talking to James about our reflections very briefly. And James, not only is James the chair of ALCA's Sector Development Committee and also a director of ALCA, but James is also the CEO of the Tasmanian Land Conservancy and has brought a great contingent of Tassie Land Conservancy folk to the conference. So James, really I just wanted to explore with you as the chair of the Sector Development Committee, what does sector development mean for you? And does a conference like this help?
Thanks, Jody. And also, how cool is this, hey?
I know,
this is
so
cool.
good.
We thought we would have this conversation too. It's going to be a bit lighthearted because we're not overly prepared for it.
No.
And I think from a sector development perspective and in our committee, it's so much fun having conversations. And to sit up here, I was sitting up the back this morning reflecting on all the conferences that ALCA has had, and I am a little bit of a fanboy. I've got every badge, I've been to every one. And
you know there's a name for people like you.
Is there?
Yeah.
What is it?
I don't know. Nigel, am I allowed to say what the name is? I think we banned it, didn't we?
What was it?
Alcoholics.
Alcoholics.
Not quite sure if we should ask how many alcoholics there are in the room.
But I guess thinking of sector development, and I think of the development of ALCA and the leadership that you've shown, Jody, and of the board and the committee members, past and present, that sit on the Sector Development Committee, we always saw the conference as a great way of demonstrating the value of the sector while also growing the sector at the same time. And you know, it is, you can say it's a ticker box in terms of, oh, we've done a conference, what's the value of a conference, how do you quantify the value of conferences? But I have lifelong friends that I've met at this conference, from the first one in Latrobe in 2015, where I still remember cleaning up the exam hall at Latrobe University where they gave us a free space and they literally had a party, and then the next day we had a conference there, to this. Oh my God, how professional and incredible is this?
It's amazing. It's the first time we've had an exhibition hall.
Mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing.
So I guess to go back to your question, I think sector development from a private land conservation space, in my view and my experience and what we talk about in our committee, is about relationships, and it's about trust that's built through those relationships. We all work with landholders, Aboriginal groups, community groups. Lots of the successes that we have are formed through those relationships and trust. There's a thing that Jody's probably sick of me going on about this, but there's a thing that you should all Google called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a global trust index that's been going for 23 years now. And the last 3 years, Australia has been the worst performing country in the world. We've declined in trust drastically, and we're sitting on the cusp of complete and utter polarisation. It is so sad to see that. But when you come to a conference like this and you engage with each other and you build those relationships, you foster new relationships, you see that actually trust is core to effective relationships and effective conservation. Yeah. And I hope that's what we're doing through sector development at ALCA.
Yeah, absolutely, that's so true. And I think the other part of all of that is that, like, you think about the conversations that we've been having today and how quickly everything is moving. The other key part of sector development is keeping the sector developing. And so conferences like this where people can come together and learn stuff, and not necessarily in those rooms, sometimes in those rooms, sometimes here in these rooms, but sometimes in the coffee room, but learn things from each other through formal and informal ways to keep us up to date with what's happening, to have different people come up onto the stage and say, you've got to be watching out for the ISSB and the TNFD and all the other things. All of those elements of coming together and learning from each other and from others that are not always in the room is going to be critical if we're to meet the challenges that are coming ahead of us.
I think too, coming from Tasmania, the South Island, and you know, we work so hard in the work that we do, and each of us, and it's so great to have so many folk from Tassie here, landholders as well as staff from our organisation. But you recognise too, when you're working so hard on a particular thing, you don't feel like you're part of this amazing community. So hopefully when you go back to that hard slog, whether you're controlling weeds, whether you're planting plants, whatever you're doing, or dealing with difficult landholders, remember that you're all part of this community and you're all contributing, because we can feel isolated so much in the work that we do. And from our organisation's perspective, being a part of ALCA, bringing our staff, our community to this broader community, it's a really powerful thing. And, you know, I don't think we sit back enough as conservationists and do things that fill our cups, because we're so passionate, because so much needs to be done. So I really hope that you all take that little bit of secret sauce when you leave ALCA, and you have that buzz when you go back, and you tell more people to come, and you encourage those quiet conservationists that are so determined but they don't invest in themselves. And we had a Future Leaders morning tea, you might have remembered, Anne mentioned it. Guess how many people turned up? Any guesses? 0. You're all future leaders. You're all current leaders. And I really, really encourage you to step into that, hold it, take it. I was going to say by the neck, that's a bit intense. But, you know, it's so important that you all see yourselves as leaders, because you are. You're all incredibly inspiring. And, you know, it's a real privilege to be involved at ALCA and hopefully develop that sector and be part of it.
Yep. I'm going to ask you for one more reflection of something that's happened for you or you've observed over the last 2 days, because we've had a workshop already and this is day 1. For me, one of the things, somebody came up to me earlier today and we were talking about different conferences. Some of us have been to a few. And they mentioned our last face-to-face conference in 2019. And they said, the thing about this one is that we're not having to make the case so much this year. 2019, we had to make quite a big deal about trying to just, you know, do we understand the case enough? And I think it made me really reflect on how much has changed in terms of where biodiversity decline has gone and our understanding of that. And I think that context of the number of reports, the amount of conversations that's going on, the data and then the information that's being shared. And I think that was a really interesting reflection. Certainly the speed and pace since we met last seems to have shifted.
Yeah, I think reflecting too, there's a change in the narrative, and there is it's important to acknowledge the weekend that we've had, and I think a lot of people have walked into this space feeling pretty flat and low. And I feel that people have seen this, the authenticity of people in their sharing. And I was thinking this morning in the open plenary, nothing against policy, Vic, because I know policy is so important, but we have a little, sector development versus policy committees in ALCA. But, a policy session was started with all of those panellists talking about their individual connection to nature. And I reflect on the power of people sharing their stories. I would say that there was 2 Tasmanian mentions. We had the Styx Valley and a chance encounter with a quoll. Who knew? But, and then we've heard so many other conversations of people sharing that connection that they have. And, I think in reflecting on where we're at the last 24 hours, 2 days that we've been here, we've heard about the challenges that we have, but we've heard about the small, simple things that we can do. And I would also suggest, backing yourself in those simple decisions and small decisions that you might not feel make a difference on their own, but collectively they're contributing to something really, really special. And I was thinking when you posed this question to me, Jody, before we agreed about an hour ago to have this conversation, and I'm reading a book at the moment by Daka Keltner. He's a psychologist, and he's really interested in the science of awe and how you describe awe and what are the elements of awe. And he interviewed thousands of people all over the world and got people to share their stories of awe. And then they've come up with 8 key wonders of the world that are awe-inducing. And 3 of them we heard today. In my mind, I reflect on it. There's the moral beauty of others when they share what they do. There's nature itself. And then there's collective effervescence, which is such an incredible phrase. And I think on reflection, the collective effervescence of this room, of this community coming together from all over the country, some from across the seas too, I think is a really powerful reminder that in really, really dark times, it's important to stick together, it's important to come together, and it's important to find the things that bind us and not divide us.
And that's a beautiful way to finish this conversation, James. Let's take our collective effervescence, if I can say the word, into our dinner this evening. And I think you're going to coordinate a photo. But James, thank you for joining us. It's been great to have this conversation, and thank you everyone for a fabulous day. It's been lots of fun. Thanks.
Thanks, Jody.